There is a silence in the deep universe that feels heavy, like a velvet blanket drawn over the sleeping face of the cosmos. In the cool, crisp air of the late October, the great glass eyes of our world turned upward in unison. High above the cloud layers of the Atacama, and on the lonely peaks of Mauna Kea, the sentinels of humanity began their silent watch. They were tracking a ghost, a drifting shadow, that had emerged from the interstellar void. The catalogues designated it simply as 3I Atlas, a name that felt clinical and cold on the pages of scientific journals. But to the astronomers sitting in the blue glow of their control rooms, it was something far more profound than a mere catalogue number. It was a wanderer from the dark, a traveller that had crossed the abyss between stars to reach our lonely harbour. For weeks the scientific community had been lulled into a sense of routine, believing this visitor to be nothing more than a frozen remnant of a forgotten system. The initial data suggested a lifeless rock, tumbling aimlessly through the velvet black. We expected it to behave like every other comet or asteroid that graces our skies, a predictable dancer following the rigid choreography of gravity. But as the nights grew longer and the Earth tilted away from the Sun, 3I Atlas began to defy the script we had written for it. As it plunged toward Perihelion, the point of its closest approach to our burning star, physics dictated that it should awaken. We expected the ice on its surface to scream, sublimating into a brilliant tail of gas and dust that would catch the sunlight. We waited for the flare, the sudden brightening that signals a comet is bleeding its life into the void. But the telescope saw only darkness. The light curves on the monitors remained flat, a stubborn horizontal line that refused to rise. It was as if the object was immune to the heat, or perhaps it was made of something that did not know how to melt. The anticipation in the observatories shifted subtly into unease, a quiet tension that rippled through this global network of observers. Why was it so dark, and why did it feel so deliberate? The standard models of reflection failed to explain its appearance, rendering it as a silhouette against the backdrop of the Milky Way. Instead of reflecting the solar radiation, 3I Atlas seemed to be absorbing it, drinking in the light like a thirsty traveller finding water after a long drought. This was not the erratic tumbling of a jagged rock, but the steady, smooth motion of something with significant mass and stability. Astronomers rechecked their calculations, cleaning their lenses and questioning their sensors. Yet the data remained absolute, painting a portrait of an object that was fiercely indifferent to our expectations. It moved with a terrifying grace, sliding through the solar system with no tail and no coma. It was a dark needle threading the planetary orbits, aiming for the heart of our system. In the silence of the control rooms, coffee grew cold and conversations turned to hushed whispers. The realization began to dawn not with a shout but with a shiver, that we were looking at something unprecedented. If it was natural, it was a miracle of geological formation that we had never seen before. But the human mind is wired to see patterns, and the pattern here was one of concealment. It felt less like a dead stone falling through gravity, and more like a vessel running silent. As October faded and the object drew nearer to the fire of the sun, the visual data became even more perplexing. There were no jets of gas, no fragmentation, just a solid, unyielding void moving at thousands of miles per hour. It was hiding in plain sight, cloaked in its own lack of features. The scientific term for this is low albedo, a measure of how little light a surface reflects. But the poetry of the moment suggested something else entirely, something that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. It suggested that 3I Atlas was not merely passing through, but that it was observing. It was not reflecting the light of our sun because it did not want to be seen, or perhaps because it was using that energy for a different purpose. The universe is full of noise and chaos, exploding stars and colliding galaxies. But this was the opposite of chaos. This was a profound and structured stillness. As the world below slept in ignorance, a few hundred men and women stared at screens filled with static and shadows. They realized that the darkness was not empty, but full of intent. The object was not dead, it was simply waiting. Information in our modern age usually flows like a river, a constant and unstoppable torrent of data that connects us all. We have grown accustomed to the steady pulse of updates, the scrolling numbers and the live feeds from the edge of the world. But on a Tuesday, shortly after the discovery of 3i Atlas, the river suddenly froze. It began in the deep corners of the internet, where the amateur astronomers gather to share their nightly vigils. These are the sleepless watchers, the enthusiasts with telescopes in their backyards and eyes that never tire. They were the first to notice the discrepancy, a subtle deviation in the orbital trajectory that did not match the official charts. The forums began to buzz with questions, threads of conversation weaving together into a tapestry of confusion. They pointed their browsers toward the Jet Propulsion Laboratory database, expecting to find a correction or a new set of coordinates. Instead, they found a void. The page simply refused to load. At first, it was dismissed as a server error, a technical hiccup in the vast machinery of space surveillance. But then the pattern spread like a contagion. The European Space Agency's Near-Earth Object page went dark. The tracking feeds from the Minor Planet Center stuttered and stopped. One by one, the digital windows into the cosmos were shuttered. It was a coordinated blackout, a sudden lowering of a curtain across the stage of the solar system. For the public, there was only a frustrating silence, a spinning loading icon that led nowhere. But for those who understand how these agencies operate, the silence was screaming. Governments do not hide boring data. They only hide what they cannot explain or what they fear. The clock began to tick on this unnatural quiet. 1 hour turned into 10, and 10 stretched agonizingly into 20. In the absence of facts, speculation began to bloom like a dark flower. Why would the guardians of our sky suddenly cover their eyes? The answer lay in the nature of the object itself. 3i Atlas had done something, or perhaps it had revealed something, that shattered the standard protocols of transparency. Imagine the scene inside those command centers, the frantic energy contained within soundproof walls. Men and women in white shirts loosening their ties, staring at monitors that showed a reality they were not ready to share. They needed time to verify the impossible, to run the simulations again and again until the result changed. But the result did not change. The object was behaving with a precision that nature rarely employs. As the blackout entered its 30th hour, the mood shifted from annoyance to a deep primal unease. The silence suggested a loss of control. It suggested that the people in charge were no longer observing a rock, but were grappling with a presence. 40 hours is a long time to hold your breath, a long time to keep a secret from a world that is always watching. During that window of time, humanity was essentially blind. We were left to look up at the night sky with our naked eyes, wondering what was moving through the darkness above our heads. The official statement came much later, citing routine maintenance and data recalibration. It was a sterile explanation, a carefully crafted lie designed to soothe the nervous system of the public. But the data that came back online was different. It was sanitized. The raw trajectory files were gone, replaced by smoothed averages that hid the anomalies. The amateur community knew they had been cut out of the loop. They realized that the era of open discovery was over. The silence of those 40 hours marked a threshold. Before that moment, 3i Atlas was a scientific curiosity. After that moment, it was a matter of planetary security. Something had looked back at us from the void, and the first instinct of our leaders was to close the blinds. The data streams returned, but the trust did not. We were left with the lingering coldness of the realization that we were being protected from the truth. And in the quiet of the cosmos, truth is often the most dangerous thing of all. We often forget that we live inside the atmosphere of a star, a chaotic environment where fire dictates the rules of existence. The sun is usually an indifferent monarch, casting its light equally upon the just and the unjust. But 3 days after the data blackout, the monarch woke up in a rage. Solar physicists monitoring the observatories were the first to see the warning signs, manifesting as a complex tangle of magnetic field lines twisting near the solar equator. It was a sunspot of terrifying magnitude, a black abyss opening on the burning surface that grew rapidly, until it was large enough to swallow the Earth whole. The instrument screamed with static, registering a build-up of potential energy that was far beyond the seasonal averages. This was not the gentle breathing of the solar cycle, it was the tense holding of breath before a scream. The tension snapped in a fraction of a second. A blindness of white light overwhelmed the senses as the magnetic arches collapsed. The sun had fired. A coronal mass. Ejection of biblical proportions tore free from the star's gravity, hurling 1 billion tons of superheated plasma and charged particles into the void. Usually these storms are shotgun blasts, spraying wild and wide into the emptiness. But as the trajectory data poured in, the blood drained from the faces of the analysts. This was not a spray. It was a sniper shot. The immense wall of fire was moving in a tight, coherent column, carving a burning path through the freezing dark. It bypassed the Earth, ignoring our magnetic fields entirely. It bypassed Mars and the asteroid belt. The geometry of the blast was perfect. It was heading directly for the coordinate point of 3I Atlas. In the quiet hum of the control rooms, the realization was heavy and disturbing. The statistical probability of a random solar flare hitting a tiny object millions of miles away is virtually zero. It is like firing a rifle into a hurricane and hitting a specific raindrop. Yet the data was undeniable. The sun had aimed at the intruder. A deep primal feeling settled over those who watched the screens, a sensation that our understanding of the solar system was fundamentally flawed. We view the planets and the star as dead matter, governed only by the cold laws of physics. But this event suggested something biological. It looked like an immune response. Imagine a body fighting off a virus, sending white blood cells to engulf a foreign pathogen. 3I Atlas was the infection, sliding silently through the veins of our system. And the sun was the heart, pumping out a wave of fire to sterilize the threat. The speed of the plasma wave was accelerating, driven by magnetic forces that propelled it faster than any storm on record. It became a race between the silent traveller and the wall of destruction. Humanity stood on the sidelines, helpless witnesses to a war of titans. We wondered what would happen when the wave made contact. Would the object be vaporized? Would it be stripped of its dark coating and revealed for what it truly was? Or was it possible, in the most terrifying scenario of all, that the object simply would not care? The concept of the solar gun changed the narrative completely. We were no longer just observing a strange rock. We were watching our home environment react defensively. The universe was not empty and dead. It was alive, and it was angry. As the plasma storm closed the distance, the seconds stretched out into eternity. We waited for the impact, watching the telemetry with bated breath. The hammer of the sun was falling, and we could only wonder if the anvil would break. Chaos is the default language of the universe, a messy dialect written in the tumbling of rocks and the collision of dust. When astronomers look at an asteroid, they expect to see a light curve that is jagged and unpredictable. These ancient stones usually flip and roll through the void, reacting to millions of years of cosmic pinball. But the data streaming from 3I Atlas told a different story, a story written in the terrifying font of perfect order. As the telescopes collected photons from the object, the computers plotted the brightness over time. The resulting graph did not look like the signature of a rough potato-shaped rock. It looked like a sine wave. It was a smooth and rhythmic oscillation, repeating with a consistency that defied natural explanation. The analysis revealed a rotation period of exactly 16 hours. Not 15 hours and 59 minutes, not 16 hours and a few seconds of drift. It was 16 hours flat, down to the millisecond. In the control rooms, the silence grew heavy as the implication settled in. Nature rarely produces whole numbers. Nature is fractal and rough edges. A rotation this precise suggests a flywheel, or a gyroscope, or a stabilization system fighting against the drag of space. The object was not tumbling out of control. It was spinning with purpose. The imagery that came to mind was not geological, but industrial. Imagine a radar dish on a lonely naval ship, turning steadily to sweep the horizon for threats. Or the rotating section of a space station, spinning to create artificial gravity for its inhabitants. This was the behavior of a machine. With every 16-hour cycle, 3I Atlas was exposing a different face to the sun, and then turning back to the dark. It felt like a surveillance sweep, a systematic scan of the planetary neighborhood. As the Earth rotated on its own axis, we were falling in and out of its view. The scientists tried to fit the data to models of elongated asteroids, hoping that shape alone could explain the regularity. But the math refused to cooperate. The dampening forces of the interstellar medium should have introduced a wobble. There was no wobble. The axis of rotation was locked tight. It was as if the object was correcting itself, making micro-adjustments to maintain its scan rate. This anomaly stripped away the comfort of the object being a dead stone. Dead things do not keep time. Dead things surrender to entropy. 3I Atlas was resisting entropy. It was imposing order on the vacuum. To the observers watching the light curve dip and rise, it became hypnotic. It was a heartbeat in the dark, slow and steady and relentless. It meant that whatever this thing was, it was functioning. It was operational. The 16-hour cycle became a countdown for the researchers. They began to time their shifts around it. They watched the peak of the brightness, wondering what sensors were active at that moment. Was it listening to our radio waves? Was it mapping the heat signatures of our cities? The precision was the message. It told us that this visit was not an accident of gravity. It was a calculated arrival. The object was not just passing by. It was watching us, and it was not blinking. We usually measure the power of a celestial object by its sheer mass, assuming that in the cold calculus of the cosmos size equates to strength. We expect giants to roar and dwarfs to remain silent. But as the thermal imaging data from 3I Atlas finally cleared the static of the interstellar medium, a shocking contradiction bloomed on the screens of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The scientists were hunting for a mountain floating in the void, a jagged asteroid large enough to explain the gravitational perturbations we had witnessed. Instead, they found a ghost, or rather a speck of dust masquerading as a god. The thermal models were run and re-ran, stripping away the layers of noise until only the hard truth remained. The physical core of the object, the tangible matter that we could touch and weigh, was impossibly small. It measured a mere 2.8 kilometers across. In the grand theatre of space, this is nothing more than a piece of gravel, a tiny insignificant splinter of rock that should have been invisible to our senses. But surrounding this tiny heart was a monster, a vast and terrifying structure that defied all natural explanation. The sensors detected a halo, a colossal cloud of interference that extended outwards for millions of miles. In the lexicon of cometary science, we call this a coma, the fuzzy envelope of gas and dust that forms when ice begins to sublime near the sun. But the coma of 3I Atlas was not made of water vapour, nor was it made of carbon dioxide or silicate dust. The spectral analysis returned a flat line for matter, but a screaming peak for energy. It was a field of pure electromagnetic density, a shimmering ocean of charged potential. The scale of this invisible structure was humbling. The data suggested the field was half the width of our own sun. Imagine a structure so vast that it could swallow the orbits of Mercury and Venus, yet generated by a source no bigger than a downtown city district. The disparity was nauseating. It induced a sense of vertigo in the researchers who stared at the false colour maps. How could a pebble hold a storm of that magnitude? It violated the laws of thermodynamics as we understood them. To maintain a coherent field of that size against the pressure of the solar wind, the core would need to generate energy equivalent to a small star. It was not just a rock drifting through space, accumulating static charge from the friction of the void. It was an engine. It was a reactor screaming into the silence, burning with a cold and invisible fire. The coma acted like a shroud, a deliberate veil designed to confuse our instruments and hide the truth of the centre. We realised with a creeping chill that we were not looking at the object itself. We were looking at its footprint. We were staring at the exhaust plume of a technology we could not comprehend. The density readings of the core suggested something metallic and supercompressed, a singularity of engineering that held the storm together. It made the planets of our solar system look like drifting balloons, empty and light compared to this bullet of condensed power. Deep inside that colossal storm of invisible energy, something small and dense was humming. It was like a diamond hidden in the centre of a hurricane. The mystery was no longer about what the object was made of, but what it was doing. Natural objects do not project force fields. Natural objects do not wear masks of lightning. We had found the needle in the haystack, but the needle was radioactive, and the haystack was made of electricity. The invisible structure was not a byproduct of its journey, it was the very thing that allowed it to move. As the night deepened over the observatories, the realization settled in that we were watching a vessel wrapped in its own atmosphere, and whatever was piloting that vessel, sitting in that tiny dense core, was safe behind a wall of fire that was half the size of a star. The shutter of a camera is an eyelid that refuses to blink, holding its gaze open to drink in the faint light of the cosmos. When astronomers finally processed the deep exposure images of 3I Atlas, a ghost appeared in the grain of the photograph that should not have been there. It was a feature that defied the fundamental rules of cometary behavior, a violation of the physics that govern how objects move through the solar wind. We are taught that the tails of comets are submissive things, always surrendering to the pressure of the sun. The relentless stream of solar particles acts like a gale force wind, blowing gas and dust away from the star, creating a trail that follows the object. But 3 Atlas was not following the rules of the wind. The long exposure revealed a sharp spike of light protruding from the front of the object, pointing directly at the heart of our burning sun. It was an anti-tail, a lance of brightness aiming upstream against the flow of the solar system. In the sterile language of astrophysics, there is a comforting explanation for this phenomenon. They call it an optical illusion, a trick of perspective caused when the Earth crosses the orbital plane of the comet. The scientists argued that we were merely seeing old dust, projected in a way that made it appear to be leading the charge. They tried to sanitize the anomaly with geometry, dismissing the visual evidence as a phantom of alignment. But the human eye is an ancient instrument, evolved to detect intent and agency in the natural world. And what the eye saw on those high-resolution monitors was not a trick of the light, but a display of force. To move against the current requires strength. To point into the gale of solar radiation without flinching requires power. As the image was enhanced and the contrast deepened, the spike did not look like drifting dust. It looked like a plume. It resembled the high-energy exhaust of a retro rocket, firing desperately to shed velocity. The visual language was not geological, it was industrial and mechanical. Imagine a ship entering a harbour too fast, reversing its engines to fight the momentum of its journey. That is what 3I Atlas looked like in the silence of the vacuum. It appeared to be braking. The implications of this visual paradox were chilling for those who understood orbital mechanics. If the object was indeed braking, it meant it had a destination. Falling rocks do not care where they land, but a vessel slows down when it wants to arrive. The anti-tail became a focal point of obsession for the amateur community, who stripped away the scientific jargon to look at the raw reality. They saw a vector of energy. They saw a struggle against the gravitational slide. The standard models of reflection failed to account for the intensity of the spike, which glowed with a fierce and steady luminance. It was not the soft scattering of sunlight on ice, but the harsh glare of something burning. In the quiet hours of the night, the debate raged between the skeptics and the believers. Was it a rare alignment of dust and shadow, or was it the signature of an engine waking up after a long sleep? The universe drifts, yielding to the curvature of space and time. But machines steer, machines impose their will upon the trajectory. The anti-tail was the visible scar of an invisible effort, a testament to a force that was fighting the sun itself. As we stared at that impossible line of light, cutting through the darkness like a needle, the comforting idea of a dead rock began to dissolve. We were watching something slow down, and we were the ones standing on the landing pad. The space between the planets is often imagined as a tranquil void, a silent black ocean where nothing ever happens. But in reality it is a violent river of invisible fire, flowing endlessly from the burning surface of the sun. We call this torrent the solar wind, a relentless stream of charged particles that moves fast enough to strip the atmosphere from a world. For any object adrift in the deep solar system, this wind is an eroding force, a cosmic sandblaster that grinds down ice and stone over billions of years. When 3i Atlas began its approach toward the inner planets, it stepped directly into the teeth of this gale. The solar weather forecast predicted a heavy storm, a density of particles that should have flayed the object's surface. We expected to see a trail of debris, the scattered crumbs of a comet falling apart under pressure. But the universe has a way of humbling our expectations. As the wave of solar particles crashed against the intruder, the magnetometers on the Deep Space Network began to twitch. They were reading the magnetic environment around the object, looking for the subtle disturbances caused by a rocky body. A typical reading for a comet might fluctuate gently, a soft ripple in the magnetic fabric. But 3i Atlas did not ripple. It screamed. In a matter of moments, the magnetic intensity reading skyrocketed from a dormant 30 nanoteslas to a staggering 300. The graph on the monitor did not curve upward. It formed a vertical wall. This was not a natural fluctuation of background noise, nor was it the random static of the void. It was a surge of deliberate and focused power. It was the cosmic equivalent of a muscle tensing before a blow, or a blast door slamming shut. Instead of being stripped away by the solar wind, the object was wrapping itself in a cocoon of ionized gas. The data painted a picture of a perfect bow shock, a curved barrier standing firm against the flow of the sun. It was harvesting the energy of the storm, twisting the solar wind into a shield of its own making. Geology does not know how to parry a blow. Rocks do not raise their hands to block the light. But 3i Atlas had engaged its defences with a terrifying efficiency. The plasma shield was shimmering invisibly in the dark, a force field generated by the mysterious engine at its core. To the scientist watching the telemetry, this was the final nail in the coffin of the natural object theory. Dead things drift and decay, surrendering to the entropy of the universe. But living things, or designed things, fight back to preserve their integrity. The jump to 300 nanoteslas was a message written in electromagnetism. It told us that the object was aware of the environment, and it was reacting to it. As the solar wind howled silently against that magnetic bubble, we could almost hear the hum of the generators deep inside the object. It was no longer just a visitor passing through our neighbourhood. It was a vessel buttoning up its coat against the cold. The realization brought a profound sense of vulnerability to those watching from Earth. We have no shields against the dark. We are naked under the stars. But 3i Atlas was armoured, protected by a wall of lightning that it could summon at will. And as it moved deeper into the solar system, safe behind its burning veil, we wondered what else it was capable of surviving. In the vast clockwork of the solar system, mathematics is the only true prophet. We feed the variables of mass and velocity into our supercomputers, and they return a vision of the future that is absolute and undeniable. When the trajectory of the massive coronal mass ejection was overlaid with the path of 3i Atlas, the simulation did not show a near miss. It showed a collision course so precise that it looked like a handshake between titans. The date was set for November 22nd. In the control rooms of the world, that date became a focal point of dread and fascination, a fixed point in time where the destiny of the intruder would be decided. The geometry of the encounter was breathtaking in its perfection. The object was not just drifting into the path of the storm, it was arriving at a specific intersection point on the ecliptic plane, the invisible flat disk upon which the planets dance around the sun. To achieve such an alignment by chance involves odds so astronomical that they defy the comfort of coincidence. It felt less like a random accident of space, and more like a scheduled appointment. As the days ticked down toward the 22nd, the tension in the scientific community became palpable. We were watching two unstoppable forces rushing toward a single coordinate. On one side was the fury of the sun, 1 billion tons of superheated plasma screaming through the void at millions of miles per hour. On the other side was 3i Atlas, the silent dark traveller wrapped in its enigmatic shield. The question on every screen and in every hushed conversation was simple. What happens when the hammer strikes the anvil? Conventional physics offered a bleak prediction for the object. A cometary body, largely made of ice and loose rock, should be vaporized by an impact of this magnitude. It should shatter into a cloud of superheated dust, a brief firework display to mark the end of its journey. But the behaviour of 3i Atlas had already proven that it was not conventional. The anti-tail and the plasma shield suggested a resilience that we could not quantify. A disturbing hypothesis began to circulate among the more imaginative theorists. What if the object was not trying to avoid the storm? What if it had positioned itself there on purpose? The perfect inclination on the ecliptic plane, the timing of its arrival, the stabilization of its rotation. It all pointed toward a deliberate maneuver. Perhaps this was not an execution, but a refueling. Imagine a ship sailing into a hurricane, not to be destroyed, but to catch the wind in its sails. The energy contained within that wall of solar fire was immense, capable of powering a civilization for centuries. If 3i Atlas had the technology to absorb it, to drink the fire rather than burn in it, then November 22nd would not be an end. It would be a beginning. It would be the moment the batteries were charged. The world watched as the distance closed, the red line of the storm and the black line of the object inching closer on the displays. There is a specific kind of silence that falls before a collision, a suspension of breath as the inevitable rushes in. We were witnessing fate's geometry in motion, a celestial mechanic that cared nothing for our fears or our theories. The universe was about to conduct a stress test on the intruder, and we were the audience, sitting in the dark, waiting to see if the monster would break, or if it would simply open its mouth and swallow the sun. In the age of total connectivity, a secret is a difficult thing to keep. Information behaves like water, always seeking a crack in the dam to flow through. While the official press conferences spoke of ice sublimation and cometary outgassing, a different narrative was taking shape in the shadows. It began on the fringe forums and the encrypted chat rooms, places where amateur astronomers and data hackers congregate to trade whispers. The rumour centred on the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, a sentinel that has been circling the red planet for years. This satellite carries HiRISE, the most powerful camera ever sent to another world. It is capable of resolving objects as small as a dinner table from hundreds of miles up. According to the flight logs, which are publicly available, the orbiter performed a scheduled slew maneuver 3 days ago. It turned its great telescopic eye away from the red dust of Mars and pointed it into the black abyss. It was looking at 3i Atlas. The timestamps confirm the observation took place, yet the image gallery remained empty. There was a gap in the sequence, a digital silence where a photograph should have been. This absence of evidence became evidence itself. Why hide a picture of a dirty snowball? The answer arrived in the form of a leak, a single file uploaded to a temporary server before being scrubbed by the sensors. It was not a photograph, but a spectral analysis. Spectroscopy is the fingerprint of the universe, breaking light down into its component colours to reveal the chemical composition of the source. Every element on the periodic table has a unique barcode of light. Ice looks a certain way, rock looks a certain way. When independent analysts ran the leaked data through their models, the results were baffling. The absorption lines did not match the signature of frozen water or carbon monoxide. They did not match the silicates found in asteroids. The graph was smooth and cold, dominated by heavy elements and complex reflectivity. It looked like metal. Not the raw iron found in meteorites, which is jagged and impure. This was a refined alloy. The spikes in the data suggested a blend of titanium and unknown composites, materials that require heat and engineering to exist together. The implications of this were heavier than the object itself. Nature can forge iron in the hearts of dying stars, but it does not smelt alloys into smooth hulls. If the surface of 3i Atlas was indeed metallic, then the coma we had seen was not gas escaping from a crack. It was something else entirely. Perhaps it was a magnetic shield interacting with the hull, or the glow of the metal itself reacting to the solar wind. The leak confirmed the suspicion that had been growing in the collective unconscious of the world. We were not looking at a piece of geology. We were looking at a piece of technology. The silence of the space agencies was not due to a lack of data, but due to an excess of it. They knew. They had seen the glint of the sun on that polished skin, and they were terrified of what it meant. The realization shifted the fear into a different register. A rock is a mindless hazard, a bullet fired by gravity. But a metal ship has a captain. It has a purpose. As the file circulated through the underground networks, reproduced on thousands of screens, the official story began to crumble. We were no longer tracking a comet. We were tracking a visitor who arrived in a suit of armour. And as we looked at that cold, spectral graph, we wondered if the armour was there to protect the ship from space, or to protect space from what was inside the ship. The moments before a catastrophe are often the quietest, a suspended silence that hangs heavy over the world. As the colossal wave of the solar storm raced through the inner solar system, humanity stood watching from the safety of Earth. The calculations had been checked and rechecked 1,000 times. The impact was inevitable. The wall of plasma was hours away from the coordinates of 3i Atlas, closing the distance with the relentless apathy of nature. In the observatories the mood was sombre. The scientists believed they were about to witness a funeral. They expected the frail body of the comet to crumble under the thermal shock, vaporizing into a cloud of meaningless dust. But in the deep darkness of the void, something else was happening. Something that was not written in the textbooks of astronomy. Just before the first tendrils of the solar wind could touch the object, the light curve on the monitors changed. It did not rise gently as it would with the slow heating of the sun. It went vertical. In a fraction of a second, the brightness of 3i Atlas increased by a factor of 10,000. At first, the astronomers breathed a sigh of relief, believing nature was finally taking its course. They thought the heat had cracked the crust, triggering a massive release of gas and ice. They thought they were seeing a coma bloom. But the spectral analysis killed that hope immediately. This was not the warm, diffuse glow of sunlight reflecting off dust. It was a cold, piercing blue, the distinct signature of high-energy ionization. It was the colour of Cherenkov radiation, the ghostly glow of nuclear reactors underwater. The realization hit the control rooms like a physical blow. This was not a reflection. This was a transmission. The object was generating its own light. It looked less like a melting iceberg, and more like a city grid coming online after a blackout. We were witnessing the end of a hibernation that had lasted for millennia. Deep within the metallic core, ancient circuits were flooding with power. Systems that had been dormant since before the pyramids were built were suddenly screaming to life. The timing was too precise to be a coincidence. It was not reacting to the storm after it hit. It was powering up to meet it. The sudden luminosity revealed details we had never seen before. The vague shape of the object sharpened into a defined geometry, lit from within by the coursing energy of its own veins. It was a machine stretching its limbs, a beast opening its eyes. The energy output was staggering, comparable to the total electrical consumption of a small continent. And yet it was silent. There was no radio broadcast, no message for us. The awakening was entirely internal. It was a preparation. As the solar storm finally crashed against the object, it did not find a sleeping victim. It found a fortress with the lights on. The collision of the plasma wave and the object's energy field created a display of auroras that blinded the senses. It was a war of light in the darkness. And in that blinding flash, the last pretense of this being a natural phenomenon evaporated. Rocks do not wake up. Rocks do not wait for the storm to start their engines. 3i Atlas was awake, and for the first time in human history, we realized we were sharing the solar system with an active intelligence. The sleep of the ages was over. The visitor was ready to work. Violence in the cosmos is usually a slow and grinding process, measured in the erosion of craters or the gradual dying of stars over eons. But the collision between the solar storm and 3i Atlas was instantaneous, a release of energy so violent it defies human comprehension. Imagine the combined explosive power of billions of atomic weapons detonating in a single silent second against a solitary point in the dark. The coronal mass ejection did not wash over the object like a gentle tide of water. It struck like a solid hammer made of superheated light, crushing the magnetic environment with a force that should have pulverized a planet. On Earth, the effects were immediate and visceral. The telemetry screens in the deep space control rooms flickered and seized, overwhelmed by the sudden surge of electromagnetic noise that washed across the system. It was a sensor saturation event. The delicate eyes of our satellites were blinded by the glare. For a few agonizing heartbeats, the monitors showed only static, a blizzard of white snow caused by the overload of the input channels. The data streams that had been flowing steadily for weeks were severed, replaced by the harsh hiss of cosmic interference. In the control rooms, men and women stood frozen, their faces illuminated by the chaotic flashing of the displays. There is a specific kind of dread that comes with a loss of signal, a primal fear of the unknown rushing back in to fill the gap. The simulation models had predicted a massive brightening followed by a thermal decay, the signature of a rock vaporizing under extreme heat. But the reality was far more disorienting. When the digital dust finally settled and the algorithm scrubbed the interference from the live feed, the astronomers leaned forward expecting to see the debris field. They expected to see the glowing remnants of a shattered world, drifting aimlessly into the void. Instead, they saw nothing. The coordinate point where the object should have been was empty. 3i Atlas was gone. It had vanished from the tracking grids completely, leaving a hole in the data that was more terrifying than the explosion itself. The background stars twinkled coldly in the distance, seemingly mocking the emptiness where the intruder had stood. Panic began to ripple through the communication loops. Had the object been completely annihilated? Was it possible to atomize a structure that large so quickly? The physics did not make sense. Even a vaporization event leaves a cloud, a ghost of gas and dust that lingers for days. But this was a clean slate, a total erasure. It was as if the object had never existed at all. The silence from the sensors was absolute, a heavy and oppressive weight that pressed down on the observers. Minutes stretched into an hour, and still the screen showed only the empty velvet black of space. The skepticism that had defined the early days of the discovery evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of loss. We had found something miraculous, and the sun had destroyed it before we could understand it. Or so we thought. Deep in the noise of the static, a pattern began to emerge again. But the disappearance itself had changed us. It forced us to confront the fragility of our connection to the universe. We were watching a magic trick performed on a galactic scale. The magician had covered the object with a cloak of fire, and when the cloak was pulled away, the stage was empty. The void left behind was not just a lack of matter, it was a lack of answers. And in that terrifying gap, we were left alone with our own reflection in the dark screens. The fog of war is not exclusive to the battlefields of Earth, for even in the vacuum of space chaos leaves a haze. After the blinding violence of the impact, the digital snow on the monitors began to melt, fading back into the stark clarity of the vacuum. We waited for the image to stabilize, expecting to see the scattered crumbs of a destroyed world. We expected a cloud of expanding vapor, the final breath of a comet that had flown too close to the flame. But as the sensors locked back onto the coordinates, a collective gasp sucked the air from the control rooms. 3i Atlas was still there, but it was not the same object that had entered the fire. The solar storm had acted like a cosmic scalpel, precise and devastating in its efficiency. It had taken the comet's tail, that magnificent streamer of gas and dust, and it had ripped it cleanly from the body. In the dry terminology of astrophysics, this is known as a disconnection event. It happens when magnetic field lines snap and reconnect, severing the link between the nucleus and its trail. We watched as the tail drifted away into the dark, a ghost detached from its host, fading like smoke in a strong wind. It was amputation on a planetary scale. But while the tail was dying, the core was being born. The fuzzy, indistinct blob that had frustrated our telescopes for weeks was gone. The coma, that thick fog of ice and gas that had acted as a cloak, had been stripped away by the pressure of the blast. What remained was the thing itself. For the first time, we were seeing the naked truth of 3i Atlas. It was not a jagged rock, pitted by eons of collisions. It was a hard-edged geometry, sharp and defined against the velvet backdrop. It gleamed with a dull, metallic luster, reflecting the sunlight with a consistency that nature does not produce. The stripping of the coma felt less like an injury, and more like a shedding of skin. Imagine a moth breaking free from a dusty chrysalis, spreading wings that are wet and new, or a knight in battle, having his shield shattered, only to reveal the impenetrable armour beneath. The object looked smaller now, stripped of its atmospheric volume, but it looked infinitely more dangerous. The density of it was palpable even through the screens. It was a bullet of solid matter, unbothered by the storm that had raged around it. The camouflage was gone. The pretense of being a dirty snowball from the Oort cloud was over. The solar wind had scrubbed it clean, washing away the disguise to reveal the artifact underneath. Scientists call this a bare nucleus, a term that implies vulnerability. But looking at that stark silhouette, vulnerability was the last thing on our minds. It looked synthetic. It looked deliberate. The disconnection event had not killed it. It had refined it. It was as if the object had allowed the storm to hit it, using the energy to burn off the unnecessary weight. Now it moved with a new kind of clarity. No longer trailing a messy wake of dust, it sliced through the ether like a knife. The mystery of its composition was solved by the visual evidence alone. Ice does not hold that shape after a thermal shock. Stone cracks and splinters. Only metal endures. We realized with a shivering certainty that we had been watching a performance. The tail, the coma, the erratic brightness. They were all costumes worn to blend in with the celestial zoo. But the play was over. The actor had stepped out of character. And as 3i Atlas continued its silent fall toward the sun, naked and gleaming, we understood that the time for hiding was finished. There are two ways to observe the universe: watching the light that falls from the stars, or listening to the whispers that travel through the dark. While the optical telescopes were blind after the flash of the collision, the great radio observatories of the world turned their giant dishes toward the coordinates. The Very Large Array in New Mexico and the Massive Fast Telescope in China angled their metal ears to the sky waiting for a sound. For hours there was only the hiss of the cosmic background, the remnant static of the Big Bang that fills every corner of space. But then out of the white noise, a pattern began to emerge. It was not a loud broadcast, nor was it a greeting intended for human ears. It was a ghost signal, faint and rhythmic like the breathing of a sleeping giant. The audio technicians were the first to hear it, a soft electrostatic pulse that repeated with a terrifying regularity. Thump, silence, thump, silence. It bypassed the search for extraterrestrial intelligence protocols immediately because it lacked the complexity of a language. We have always dreamed that when the aliens call, they will send us prime numbers or the value of pi, a mathematical handshake to prove their intelligence. But 3i Atlas was not trying to prove anything to us. The signal was a stream of raw binary data, a cascade of zeros and ones flowing at a speed that overwhelmed our recorders. When the cryptographers and data scientists finally unpacked the transmission, they found no poetry and no philosophy. They found telemetry. The object was broadcasting a stream of environmental readings. It was reporting the ambient temperature of the solar corona, the density of the solar wind, and the magnetic field strength of the sun. It was a weather report sent from the eye of the storm. The disappointment in the scientific community was palpable, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of unease. If this was a report, who was it for? A probe does not broadcast data into the void for no reason. It sends it back to a receiver. It sends it home. We searched the sky for a target, looking for where the signal was aimed. But the beam was wide, omnidirectional, as if it didn't matter who heard it. Or perhaps the receiver was so far away, hidden in the deep dark between the galaxies, that the signal had to be shouted in all directions. The data stream was looping, repeating the same block of information every 40 minutes. It was a cycle that we could not decipher, a code that was locked tight. We were like insects listening to the hum of a power line, aware of the energy but ignorant of its purpose. The signal was cold, efficient, and mechanical. It confirmed that the machine inside 3i Atlas was functioning perfectly, unbothered by the violence it had just endured. It was taking notes on our star. It was measuring the heat of our fire. And as the pulses continued to wash over the Earth, rhythmic and relentless, we realized that we were not the intended audience. We were merely eavesdropping on a conversation between a traveller and its master. The object was phoning home, and the scariest part was not the message itself, but the silence that waited on the other end. The laws of physics are the bedrock of our reality, the invisible scaffolding that holds the universe together. Isaac Newton taught us that for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, a rule that has governed the motion of celestial bodies since the dawn of time. When a massive object moves through a dense medium, it must surrender some of its energy to friction. It must slow down. This is the concept of drag, the price that nature charges for movement. When the coronal mass ejection slammed into 3I Atlas, it was effectively a wall of superheated particle soup. The sheer density of the plasma should have acted like a cosmic brake, pushing the object backward and altering its orbit significantly. The orbital dynamicists at JPL had already calculated the new trajectory, factoring in the massive deceleration caused by the impact. They expected the object to be delayed, pushed off course by thousands of miles. But when the telemetry finally pierced the interference, the numbers on the screen did not match the prediction. In fact, they defied the prediction so completely that the initial reaction was to blame the sensors. The data showed that 3I Atlas had not slowed down, it had sped up. Amidst the chaos of the solar storm, surrounded by 1 billion tons of screaming plasma, the object had found a way to gain velocity. It was a subtle acceleration, a fraction of a percent increase in speed. But in the precise ballet of orbital mechanics, that fraction was a sledgehammer. It was a violation of the law of inertia. To accelerate against a headwind without a visible engine requires a force we do not understand. It suggested that the object was not interacting with the matter of the storm, but with the fabric of space itself. The scientists looked at the Doppler shift data, watching the wavelengths of light compress as the object moved away from the sun. It was climbing out of the gravity well with an impossible ease. The phrase gravitational assist is common in spaceflight, where a ship steals energy from a planet to sling itself forward. But there was no planet nearby to steal from. 3I Atlas was stealing energy from the storm itself, or perhaps it was pushing against a vacuum that should not be pushable. The implications were dizzying. If an object can ignore drag, if it can choose to accelerate when it should be stopping, then it is not a passive traveller. It is a pilot. The manoeuvre was precise, calculated to the millimetre. It corrected the orbital drift caused by the solar wind, snapping the object back onto its original dark trajectory. It was a course correction disguised as an anomaly. In the silence of the analysis rooms, the feeling of awe was mixed with a profound sense of inferiority. We are children playing with blocks, trying to understand a civilization that builds with light. The reality of the situation was bending around the object, warping the intuitive logic of cause and effect. We watched the graph of its speed climb steadily, a red line defying the downward pull of the sun. It was a display of arrogance. It was a demonstration that for 3I Atlas, the storm was not an obstacle. It was fuel. And as it surged forward, faster and cleaner than before, we realized that the laws of physics might not be universal after all. They might just be local ordinances, and the visitor had diplomatic immunity. The world waited in a silence that spanned continents, a global hush, as billions of eyes turned toward the glowing screens of their devices. It was the most anticipated broadcast in the history of space exploration, a moment promised to bring clarity to the deepening mystery of the intruder. The press briefing room at NASA headquarters was bathed in a harsh and sterile fluorescent light, a sharp contrast to the velvet darkness of the cosmos they were there to discuss. 3 figures walked onto the low stage, men and women of science draped in the heavy authority of their institution. They wore the crisp suits of bureaucracy, but their posture told a story of exhaustion and defeat. Shoulders were slumped under an invisible weight, and hands fidgeted nervously with the edges of paper notes. They called it a briefing, but to the intuitive observer it felt more like a confession given under duress. The lead administrator stepped to the podium, clearing his throat into the microphone with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. He began to read from a prepared statement, the pages trembling slightly in his grip. The words were safe and clinical, chosen with the precision of a lawyer rather than the passion of a discoverer. He spoke of Three-Eye Atlas as a natural anomaly, a rare aggregation of ice and static charge that created unique visual effects. He used terms like dust plasma structures and cometary outgassing, polysyllabic shields designed to deflect the curiosity of the public. Behind him, a large screen flickered to life. We expected to see the high-definition clarity of the Hubble or the James Webb, images that would show the pores on the skin of the object. Instead, we were shown grey smudges. The images were grainy and low resolution, deliberately blurred artifacts that looked more like ultrasound scans than astronomical photography. They pointed to the fuzzy edges and claimed it was gas. They pointed to the sudden acceleration and claimed it was the sublimation of frozen nitrogen. But the explanation felt thin, like a sheet of paper trying to hold back a flood. The cognitive dissonance in the room was palpable. We had seen the leaked data. We had seen the sharp metallic angles in the amateur photos. And now we were being told to unsee them. But the most telling detail was not the blurry slides, but the eyes of the scientists. They refused to look at the camera. Their gazes darted to the side, down at their shoes, or focused on the tops of the reporters' heads. It is a primal human instinct to break eye contact when speaking a lie, a subconscious attempt to distance oneself from the deception. Their voices lacked the ringing conviction of truth. They were flat and monotone, reciting a script that they clearly did not believe themselves. When a journalist asked about the ghost signals, the panel exchanged a quick, panicked glance before dismissing the question as sensor error. That glance gave the game away. It was a look of shared fear, a silent acknowledgement of the secrets locked in the basement. The briefing ended abruptly, with no time for follow-up questions. The scientists retreated hastily behind the blue curtain, leaving the podium empty. The live stream cut to black, leaving the world alone in the quiet of their living rooms. They had tried to reassure us that the universe was boring and predictable, but in their trembling hands and averted eyes, they had confirmed the exact opposite. They were not hiding a rock, they were hiding a presence. And the terror we saw on their faces was far more frightening than anything they could have shown us on that screen. We turned off our devices with a singular chilling realization. The people in charge are not in control, and they are just as scared of the dark as we are. The ivory towers of academia are usually quiet places, where polite debate echoes in the marble halls. But the arrival of Three-Eye Atlas shattered that peace, creating a fracture that ran deep through the foundation of knowledge. For the first time in a generation, the scientific community was not seeking consensus. It was at war. On one side stood the traditionalists, clutching their peer-reviewed papers like holy scripture. They argued with a desperate intensity that the object was dying naturally, a crumbling snowball falling apart in the heat. To them, the acceleration was just the venting of gas, and the metallic signal was a misinterpretation of the sensors. They built models of chaos and decay, trying to force the anomaly into the comfortable box of the known universe. They needed it to be a rock, because if it was a rock, they could go back to sleep. But on the other side of the divide, in the shadows of the laboratories, a different group was forming. These were the dreamers and the heretics, the ones who dared to look into the dark and see a shape. They stopped looking at the data as geology and started analysing it as engineering. On their whiteboards, the chaotic scribbles of orbital decay were replaced by the clean lines of schematics. They began to draw the outline of a machine. It was not a fantasy born of science fiction, but a hypothesis born of necessity. The 16-hour rotation was not a tumble, it was a gyroscopic stabilization. The plasma shield was not a magnetic accident, it was a deflector dish. As these forbidden diagrams took shape, a haunting story began to emerge from the numbers. The artificial hypothesis did not paint a picture of an invader coming to conquer Earth. It painted a portrait of a survivor. They imagined a probe that had travelled for millions of years, crossing the empty deserts between stars. It was old and tired, its systems failing one by one as the centuries ground them down. The damage it sustained from the solar storm was not just structural, it was critical. The ghost signals we were hearing were not the drums of war, but the frantic distress calls of a dying ship. Imagine a vessel autonomous and alone, struggling to repair itself as it drifts through a hostile system. It is trying to complete its mission, whatever that mission might be. Before the lights go out forever, the believers looked at the spectral data, the titanium and the unknown alloys, and they saw the skin of a craft that had seen the birth of nebulas. This perspective shifted the emotional weight of the event entirely. We were no longer afraid of being attacked. We were witnessing a tragedy. The acceleration away from the sun was a desperate maneuver, a final attempt to escape the gravity well and return to the deep dark. The rhythmic pulses were a heartbeat, skipping and fluttering as the power failed. While the traditionalists argued about outgassing rates, the heretics were mourning the death of a traveller. They saw 3i Atlas not as a monster, but as a messenger that had been silenced by time. And as the object moved further away, carrying its secrets into the silence, the diagrams on the whiteboards remained unfinished. They were the blueprints of a ghost, a technical drawing of something we were never meant to see. The debate would continue in the journals for years, but in the hearts of those who drew the ship, the truth was already known. We had met intelligence, and it was broken. Hindsight is a cruel telescope, always magnifying the mistakes we made when we thought we were being clever. As 3i Atlas drifted away into the outer dark, fading from the view of our most powerful lenses, the scientists on Earth began the painful process of autopsy. They returned to the archives, opening the digital vaults where the raw data of the encounter was stored. In the fever of the moment, when the object was screaming toward the sun, we were obsessed with trajectory and physical danger. We wanted to know where it was going and if it would hit us. We filtered the data streams to prioritize these variables, stripping away anything that looked like interference. We called it noise. We called it static. We treated it like dust on a camera lens, something to be wiped away so we could see the rock clearly. But in the quiet aftermath, as the algorithms were inverted to look at what we had thrown away, a ghost emerged from the trash bin. The light fluctuations we had dismissed as atmospheric distortion were not random. They possessed a syntax. When the data was visualized on the screens, it did not look like the chaotic jagged lines of cosmic background radiation. It looked like a wave, structured and repetitive, rising and falling with the precision of a language. We realized with a sickening lurch in our stomachs that we'd been listening to a symphony, and we'd complained about the volume. The object had been transmitting the entire time. It had been broadcasting a complex stream of information that layered optical pulses with radio frequency bursts. It was a high-density data package, sent on a carrier wave we were too primitive to recognize. We had looked into the face of a sophisticated intelligence, and we'd seen only a dirty snowball. But the realization went deeper than just miscommunication. As the cryptographers worked to untangle the threads of this lost signal, they found a disturbing correlation. The pulses matched the rhythm of our own planetary broadcasts. 3i Atlas was not just talking, it was listening. It was acting as a mirror, absorbing the chaotic radio leakage of Earth, processing it, and reflecting it back in a condensed format. It had scanned our television signals, our military radar, our cellular networks. It had built a picture of humanity from the noise we spill into the void. And this leads to the most haunting question of all. What did it see? It saw a civilization that is loud, chaotic, and divided. It saw a species that transmits reality television and encrypted war orders with equal enthusiasm. And having seen us, having processed the sum total of our electronic soul, it made a decision. It accelerated. It did not slow down to say hello. It did not enter a parking orbit to share its wisdom. It applied thrust and left the system faster than it arrived. This was not an invasion. It was a rejection. The silence of 3i Atlas was a judgment passed by a superior observer. It suggested that in the grand calculus of the galaxy, we did not meet the threshold for contact. We were interesting enough to scan, but not interesting enough to stop for. We often fear that aliens will come to destroy us because they hate us. But we never considered the possibility that they might simply find us boring. The data we threw away was the test, and we failed it because we were too busy looking for rocks. Now the servers hum in the empty rooms, processing the echo of a conversation we never had. We are left with the static, wondering what secrets were hidden in the noise, and watching the tail lights of the visitor fade into the eternal night. The most terrifying endings in history are rarely the ones accompanied by explosions and fire. They are the endings marked by silence and the slow fading of a light into the distance. As 3i Atlas crossed the orbit of Mars, it began to dim rapidly on the visual spectrum. The great telescopes that had tracked its every move were forced to squint, pushing their sensors to the limit to keep the traveller in view. There was no grand finale. There was no parting message carved into the surface of the moon. There was only the cold mathematics of a hyperbolic trajectory, carrying the object back into the abyss from which it came. We had spent months paralysing ourselves with scenarios of invasion. We had built bunkers in our minds, preparing for a war of the worlds that H.G. Wells would have recognised. We had also secretly hoped for salvation, dreaming that the visitor would land on the White House lawn to cure our diseases and stop our wars. But the universe is not a Hollywood script. It does not cater to our desire for drama or closure. 3i Atlas offered us neither destruction nor salvation. It offered us something far more disturbing. It offered us indifference. As the object accelerated past the gas giants, stealing a little more momentum from Jupiter's gravity well, it became clear that we were not the destination. We were a waypoint. A gas station on a lonely highway between the stars. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating. Human beings are narcissists on a planetary scale. We believe we are the center of the story. We believe that any intelligent life that finds us must inherently be interested in us. But 3i Atlas treated us with the same apathy that a highway commuter treats an anthill on the side of the road. It did not hate the ants. It likely did not even love the ants. It simply had somewhere else to be. The departure was clinically efficient. The engine, or whatever drive system lay within that dark hull, continued to burn with a silent, invisible fire. The speed of the object increased daily, putting distance between us at a rate that made our fastest rockets look like toys. It was heading for the tear in the sky, the exit vector that leads to the open ocean of interstellar space. The scientists watched the red shift of its signal, a stretching of light that signifies a goodbye that is forever. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes when a guest leaves without saying a word. The silence of the solar system felt deeper now, heavier than it had before. We had touched the edge of the miraculous, and it had pulled away from our fingers. The data it had collected, the scans of our sun and our radio leakage, were locked away in its memory banks. It was taking our secrets with it. Where was it taking them? To a homeworld orbiting a dying red dwarf? To a galactic archive floating in the void? We would never know. The mystery remained hermetically sealed. As the weeks passed, 3i Atlas became a magnitude faint star, then a smudge, and finally nothing more than a memory in the server logs. The public interest began to wane, replaced by the mundane noise of daily life on Earth. But for those who had looked into the abyss, the world had changed. We looked up at the night sky and it no longer looked empty. It looked like a room full of people who were ignoring us. The departure of the object proved that civilization can exist at a level we cannot comprehend. A level where curiosity about a primitive species like us is simply not worth the breaking fuel. It left us with our egos bruised, standing on the shore of the cosmic ocean, watching the wake of a ship that was too big to care. It was a cold departure, devoid of emotion and filled with purpose, and in its wake, we were left to ponder the chilling possibility that in the grand scheme of things, we are not the protagonists, we are just part of the scenery. When a guest departs from a room, they always leave something behind in the silence. A lingering scent of perfume, or a footprint pressed into the carpet. 3i Atlas had vanished into the outer dark, fleeing the scene of its interaction with our sun. But it did not leave without a trace. High in the upper atmosphere of Earth, and drifting through the Lagrange points of space, our collectors began to snag the microscopic debris trail. These were the particles stripped from the object during the solar storm, the dust shaken from the traveller's coat. The samples were brought back to the sterile white rooms of the laboratories to be subjected to the interrogation of mass spectrometry. The scientists expected to find the usual building blocks of the cosmos. They expected carbon and silicates, the standard ash of stellar formation. But when the results appeared on the monitors, the chemistry did not make sense. The isotopic ratios were wrong. In our solar system, every element carries a specific signature, a fingerprint left by the specific cloud of gas that birthed our sun. But this dust sang a different song. It contained isotopes of iridium and xenon that do not exist in nature here, bonded in molecular chains that looked artificial. The realization was slow and creeping, moving through the lab like a cold draft. This was not just random space dust. It was engineered matter. The particles were uniform, distinct, and terrifyingly complex. We realized that 3I Atlas had not just passed through, it had dusted us. The solar wind, that great river of particles flowing from the sun, was now carrying this alien material to every corner of the system. It was blowing the dust toward Mars, toward the asteroid belt, and toward Earth. The metaphor shifted from an autopsy to something more biological. It felt like pollination. The object had released millions of tons of these exotic particles, scattering them like seeds into the wind. What are they? Are they merely the waste product of a propulsion system, the exhaust fumes of a starship? Or are they inactive nanomachines, dormant sensors waiting for a signal to wake up? The ambiguity is the nightmare. We are now living in a solar system that has been contaminated. Every breath we take, every crop we grow, might eventually contain a single atom of this traveller. The clean isolation of our history is over. We have been touched by something from the outside. And as the scientists stare at the strange glowing dust under the microscope, they cannot shake the feeling that they are looking at a code they cannot read. The visitor has gone, but it has planted a garden in the dark, and we are left to wait and see what will grow when the seasons of the universe change. The show is finally over, and the great cosmic theatre has turned off the lights. High above the atmosphere, the sentinels of our species have returned to their routine scans. The telescopes that spent months locked in a feverish stare are now drifting back to their standard targets, cataloguing distant stars and lifeless nebulas. The sky looks exactly as it did before the arrival, a vast field of static diamonds pinned against the black velvet. But to the eyes of those who lived through the last few months, the darkness feels different now. It feels heavier. Down on Earth, the machinery of bureaucracy is working hard to restore order to our reality. The official reports have been filed, locked away in the basement of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The press conferences have ceased, and the frantic headlines have been replaced by the mundane news of politics and weather. In a final act of sanitization, the scientific community has reclassified the object. They have stripped the name 3I Atlas from the public records, replacing it with the sterile and safe designation Comet C 2024 S1. It is a name designed to be forgotten, a label that implies ice and dust and nothing more. It is a name that fits comfortably into the textbooks, sitting quietly alongside Halley and Hale Bopp. But names have power, and erasing a name is an act of fear. They want us to believe that the visitor was just a rock, because the alternative is too difficult to process. If it was a rock, then we are still the masters of our domain. We are still the only conscious minds in the solar system. But if we accept what we saw, the acceleration and the signals and the shield, then we are forced to accept a demotion. We are no longer the kings of the castle. We are merely the indigenous population of a small wet rock, watching the ships of empire sail past our shores. The public is already moving on, their attention spans drifting to the next viral trend. The fear of invasion has faded, replaced by the comfort of the daily grind. But for the astronomers and the dreamers, the silence that follows 3I Atlas is deafening. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence of a room where someone has just walked out and closed the door. We are left with the dust in our atmosphere, those alien isotopes that are slowly drifting down to settle on our roofs and in our oceans. They are the physical proof that we were touched, even if the mind tries to deny it. We are left with the hard drives full of data, the recordings of a language we will never speak. And we are left with the question that will haunt our species for the next 1,000 years. Why didn't they stop? We spent so long worrying that they would come to conquer us, or to eat us, or to teach us. We prepared for war and we prayed for peace. But we never prepared to be ignored. The ultimate humiliation for humanity is not destruction, it is irrelevance. The visitor scanned our world, measured our heat and our noise and our history. It saw our wars and our art, our cities and our forests. It saw the sum total of human achievement. And having seen it all, it simply adjusted its course and increased its speed. It did not find us worthy of a conversation. As the camera pulls back from the Earth, rising higher and higher into the quiet night, the planet looks small and fragile in the dark. The stars are indifferent witnesses to our confusion. The story of Three-Eye Atlas is not a story of first contact. It is a story of a near miss. The file is closed. The screens go black. But the final truth remains burned into our collective memory, a sentence that changes our place in the universe forever. It knows we are here, and it decided not to stop.